And thank you everybody for joining us. We have a lot of people here. It's really exciting. Welcome to ABA's Brown Bag Lunch Series, sponsored by the Gender Equity Initiative. Today, we welcome Natasha Herman of Redbone Bindery for her talk on the display of books in exhibition spaces. If anybody has any questions, you can ask them in the chat, and we can also have some discussions at the end. You can raise your hand. So I will start by introducing Natasha. We have Natasha Herman. Natasha Herman is the founder and sole proprietor of Redbone Bindery, a book conservation studio focused on the care and preservation of antiquarian books. Concurrently, she directs the STILT project, where she brings her craft and engineering skills to the design, development, and production of book support and exhibition products. Thank you so much, Natasha, for coming in. I will hand it over to you.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to try to share my screen now.
Yay. Get over that hump and you're fine.
Exactly.
There you go.
Is that working?
It's working.
And then play from start so everyone can see.
Fabulous.
Great. And then I have my little buttons. Okay, I am ready to go. So
Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to talking about exhibition of books. Most of my career I've been working in the restoration and conservation of books, but in the last 7 or 8 years, I got really interested in the problems and potential solutions for how to display books effectively and safely in different display scenarios. Let me see. Okay. To get us started, for me it's 7 p.m., so it's getting dark here. So I'm going to try to keep myself awake by explaining a paradox. This is the freeze framing paradox. It's something that we teach in conservation ethics, and it goes something like this. So we love our heritage objects. So in our case, it's antiquarian books. Because we love these heritage things, we want to keep them safe. So we want to keep them safe from harm. And in order to keep them safe, we tend to deny access to them because access could potentially lead to things getting damaged. So we deny access to these things to keep them safe. In that sense, we're sort of freeze framing them in time, a little bit like this butterfly under the bell jar. So when we aren't using them because they're they're sort of frozen in time and we're not able to use them or interact with them, we tend to forget about them. When you forget about something, you often tend to stop caring. It's just not on your radar. So, not there, stop caring, stop creating meaning making. If you don't care about them, why bother keeping them in the first place? So, that kind of brings the snake biting the tail of the paradox. And you can see through that through the paradox that we're basically balancing two extreme issues here. The one is that we really, really want to keep our things safe. And on the other, we want to be able to interact with these precious things because it's through interaction that we create meaning making that keeps us wanting to keep the things. So today, what I'm hoping to do is to talk to you guys about how to be able to display your books in a way that keeps them safe while also bringing them out, getting the butterfly out of the bell jar, so to speak. Okay. So the truth of the matter is books are intimate objects. They've been designed to be closed. 99.9% of the time, books are closed on the shelf. And they're also designed to be interacted with usually one-on-one. It's just the human and their book. And there's usually about a 30 centimeter gap between the human and the book. So there's this real intimate connection between that material book and the user of the book. And for that reason, it's sort of counterintuitive to think about, displaying it for all to see out in a museum situation. And yet that's what we're going to discuss tonight, how to actually make that happen. So they're designed to be closed, they're intimate objects, and yet we want to open them. And the moment we open them, there's this sort of feeling. I often liken it to somebody going out on the beach in like midsummer in Australia, forgot their sunscreen. Like there's this feeling that you're being highly exposed and it's a dangerous situation to be in. And so we're going to talk about how to what to do to put the sunscreen on and how long to stay on the beach, so to speak. Okay, so what I'll do is I'm going to go through I'm going to kind of name a bunch of things that I think are reasonable risks when we open our book, and then try to offer some useful, easy, low-hanging fruit ways to mitigate against those risks. So the first one is light exposure. We all know that UV can cause fading, other things as well, but fading is one of the main concerns of UV directly on colored objects. So the good news about UV and light exposure in with open books. Or with books in general, also the book bindings, is that the printed inks do not fade. They're not really susceptible to UV damage in the way that hand-colored plates are, hand-colored pigments, or marginalia or signatures, that sort of thing are. So you don't have to worry so much about just your average printed book when it's open against light. But in terms of colored stuff, yes, there's a reason why when you open a book and you see how bright the colors are on a hand printed plate, the reason they're so bright is because that book, for 99.9% of the time, is closed. So that book has never really been exposed for long periods of time to UV. And so you sort of want to keep it that way. And there are really easy ways to mitigate against UV damage. Two key things to remember: duration and intensity. If you can cut the amount of time that the open book, or the spine of the book for that matter, is exposed to the light, you're already winning a huge amount. So you do that by closing the curtains, turning the lights off. Um, Limiting your exhibition time. So you may want to exhibit the book, but maybe you only need to exhibit it for 2 days or a month or 3 months. So closing the time gap can really save an awful lot when it comes to UV exposure. The second thing is intensity of light. So closing the blinds again, taking the book out of direct sunlight. Books should never be exposed to direct sunlight. And something to keep in mind, depending on where you are in the world, you may think that you've put your book, say, in a spot in the house that doesn't have direct sunlight because it's winter, and then summer comes around and the position of the sun has changed, and suddenly you realize, oh, for the last 2 months, that book has been exposed to light at about 3 p.m. In the last month or something. So be aware of that. Best to keep your book really, really far away from windows. Use blinds, use dimmers, and in those two ways, you can really limit light exposure when your book is open. And also, don't forget that spines of book closed can also get heavily damaged from UV. So. Closing doors to bookcases and using blinds and window coverings. Okay, next obvious worry that a lot of us think about when we think about exhibiting books and think about worrying, stress on spines and joints. This is a real worry. I think I've spent a lot of my career fixing damage that's been caused by books being opened badly, being sort of squished flat down on the table, exhibited too long in an uncomfortable position. So very real worry, and yet really easy to mitigate. And to do that, I'm going to show you some pictures so that we can actually just analyze what's going on with angles here. If you open a book flat, like the picture lower left, the most flex you're going to get on any one joint at any given time is around 180 degrees, say with the front board when you're opening the book to the title page. That's an extreme angle, and it's causing extreme stress. I don't know if you can see my arrow. I'm trying to move it around the part of the picture, but you can see how much stress there is on this joint, both inner and outer. However, the moment you start to reduce the opening angle, you reduce the amount of stress on that joint by a significant amount. So this is if you're putting the book on a 120-degree opening cradle, you've already taken an awful lot of stress away from the joint. And if you further reduce it to a 90-degree opening angle, there's quite a significant reduction in stress on the joint. And I am showing you the maximum stress that can be on any given joint when that book is on a 90-degree cradle. And that's when one board is open and against and the rest of the text block is in the other direction. Of course, often we're exhibiting our books in different parts of the text block. So a quarter of the way through or half a way through, at which point then you get different stress um, uh, points acting on the book. And that is only going to reduce the amount of stress on joints, although it will increase the amount of stress on spine. And that's a more complicated story, has a lot to do with the structures of the bindings and the deterioration patterns in particular bindings. But just as a general rule, it's always going to help to limit the opening angle when you exhibit a book. And in fact, indeed, when you even use a book. Um, Okay, so that's the stress on spines and joints. Then we've got physical exposure risks. This is another real risk. When books are closed on the shelf, barring certain kind of obvious possibilities, they're generally quite safe. When a book is closed, the likelihood that you're going to have repeat damage, if you've got good air circulation and a relatively, reasonable climate control, you're unlikely to get repeat damage across the collection of books and within the book. But the moment you open a bunch of your treasured books out on the table, it's again a little bit like you're walking out onto the beach with no sunscreen. If you imagine in the image below that somebody opens the window to the right and it's storming out, wind and rain blow in, and your pages can be blown, damage can start to happen. Somebody lets the cat in, the cat jumps up on the table, mayhem. There's a leak in the ceiling because you decided you wanted to leave this exhibition open for overnight, and unfortunately, that's the night that the ceiling leaked. For all of these reasons, you can really quickly severely damage a large portion of your collection just because you've opened it up in ways that just wouldn't happen so quickly with the books closed on the shelf. However, even with this, there are really easy ways of mitigating this type of damage. So the first thing to think about is limit your exhibition time. Keep them short. You can you can do an incredible pop-up exhibition that lasts for only 2 hours, and you can make sure that it's monitored. There's somebody already always walking around the table when people are there, making sure that the books are safe, that the windows aren't being opened, that somebody hasn't walked in with their glass of whiskey, that the cat didn't get let in, et cetera, et cetera. So it's relatively easy for a short period of time to make sure that this display remains safe, even though it's so exposed. Even simple things like buffering the approach areas, making sure that there's space between the edge of the table and where the book is. Things like making sure people don't walk into the room with a wet raincoat on, or that they have some large necklace hanging off of their neck that's going to bump into the book when they lean over to take a look at it. So little things like that can go a long way in making sure that the books remain safe and that people still get to be able to really interact with them in this intimate sort of a setting. Um, okay, then we're looking at, again, physical exposure risks, but for tabletop display. And here it's interesting to think about, is it the people who are moving around the book, in which case the stuff I just mentioned earlier is useful, that buffering, the making sure people don't have necklaces, etc., or are the books moving to the people? So if people are sitting at a table, then the books will be moving to the people, and then you may have issues like passing the book over and the book falling because somebody fumbles, or greasy hands because one of those people forgot to wash their hands, but we're moving the books around, so we're actually looking at the books and turning the pages. A really easy way to mitigate against that is have books on a support, slide the supports around. You're touching the support and not the book, and that way the book stays relatively secure, flat on the table. Private libraries is another place where people might want to exhibit their books. It's a great place to exhibit your books if you're paying attention to a few really simple rules of thumb. The reason it's great is because usually you're exhibiting your book on a closed shelf, which means that f five out of six of the surfaces are really well contained. So that's a very safe place for a book to be when it's open. Rules of thumb, circulate your books. Don't keep the same book open to the same page for years on end, but turn a page every day, for instance, or choose a different book every week. By circulating, you're really mitigating your risks of damage to any particular place in the book or stress on the binding, that sort of thing. Keep windows and doors closed, obviously. Keep the wine out of the library. All right. Then we have deformation. This is something that you may not think about so often. I see it a lot in the restoration studio. It often happens when a book has been exhibited for a short period of time, pop-up exhibitions, but behind glass and under usually hot lights, or in situations where the relative humidity and temperature have been fluctuating in extreme ways over short periods of time. You can see the type of damage that this does to vellum, whether it's the pages in a book or the binding of a book. When it comes to vellum, actually, this is a relatively reversible process, but damage can be done just because there's too much undue pressure by trying to put the book back, and then the joint pops. Things can happen. The moment things get out of shape and you try to put them back into shape, you're running a risk of some having to do some major interventive work, and nothing is ever reversible. You're never going to get it back to what it was. Easy ways to mitigate against this sort of thing is to be aware of these two factors. So heat, the temperature, and humidity, the relative humidity in the air. But it's not just the actual heat or the actual temperature and relative humidity. It's these major fluctuations in a short period of time, and how they affect different types of binding materials. Ways to mitigate, because again, this is often happening. This is less likely to happen maybe in a museum setting where people have more control over the types of lighting and circulation under glass, but more likely in these pop-up under glass situations. So if you have the choice to choose between LED lighting and incandescent, obviously you're going to go with LED. There's more and more of it out there, although still you see cabinets that do have the incandescent, and the temperature differential is huge. So go for LED if you can. If you can't, be aware that your glass cabinet is heating up a little bit like a greenhouse. And so there are ways of mitigating against that. One is turn the lights off when there isn't public around. So the moment there aren't people viewing the books, turn the lights off. That's going to bring the temperature down. Keep the doors open a little bit. If you have an in and an out, you can create air circulation in your cabinet, and that's going to help keep the temperature down. And then limit the exhibition time. So keep them short. And I think if you do that, you can somewhat mitigate against these sorts of risks. These risks can create some major damage. So I think now that I've kind of put that on your plate, you're probably going to be, or hopefully, a little bit more aware of it, and a little bit more aware of how important it is to slow down those fluctuations, right? And heat and humidity changes. Another place where this happens during pop-up exhibitions is books have the great advantage of being able to move across the world really easily, unlike, say, a vase or a very large painting. However, the disadvantage of that is they're moving around the world an awful lot, which means they're sitting on the tarmac in, of like Montreal in the middle of the summer when it's plus 40, or then suddenly they're going into a cooled vehicle, or there's major fluctuations in temperature and humidity just during travel. And those are things that you want to think about when you're moving your book around. There's little that you can do about that, but what you can do, try to control a little bit in those ways that I just mentioned. Okay, then we have gravity. Sometimes gravity is our friend, and sometimes it can be a real pain in the neck. So here you see what gravity is doing to two different types of books when they're standing at a complete vertical at a 90-degree angle. I'm showing you two different types of books because different book binding structures, but also different book materials react somewhat differently to these various forces. But in both of these instances, whether you have a very modern book with very glossy paper or a very toothy old book, you're going to get sag because of gravity. So if you stand your book up at a 90-degree angle, you really would be serving your book well to try to shore up the text block of that book at the tail so that you don't get sag, the sag that you can sort of see here because of this binding structure and the sag that's happening here. So shoring the text block up helps a great deal. So under the square of the book, if you know what I mean. If you have this sag for a long period of time, because your book's standing up for a long period of time, you can really get all sorts of undue stress on these joints. Again, it's a complicated story. This depends a lot on the binding structure, but still, it's an easy thing to mitigate against. Easier than trying to shore it up is thinking about, what is that angle and how is gravity working in combination with that angle? You're getting 100% gravity when you put a book up straight. The more you tilt it back, the more you're getting just a ratio of gravity based on the angle that you're exhibiting at. So on the right, you have a picture of two different structures and types of book paper exhibited at an 80-degree angle. So we're 10 degrees off of vertical. You still need this still requires some sort of support under the text block, as you can see here. But the moment you go to 50 degrees, so 50 is still it's still a really sharp angle, right? It's more than half. Like 45 would be sort of halfway between lying flat and vertical. So 50 is quite a sharp angle, and yet if you look here, I don't know if you can tell. I tried to get a picture of the the space between the bottom edge of the board and the bottom of the text block. This is a very toothy early binding, and you can see that and this is also a tight back. You can see that the text block is very well able to stay in place. It doesn't sag the whole way along, even at a 50-degree angle, and that's just geometry combined with a little bit of friction of paper and a little bit of binding structure. Looking at a more modern binding that has slipperier paper and heavier paper, you would assume it would be more likely to sag. At a 50-degree angle, it's also not sagging. So bring that angle back even more, 35, 20, and you've got virtually no sag at all and really nothing to worry about. So sometimes the psychological worry of, oh, we always need to support our text block. In reality, it's often worth taking a look, checking to see whether that is necessary, because there are other forces acting on the book besides gravity that are working to make it such that this doesn't really have to be a worry. Okay, so now we're going to look at indirect contact. So risks associated with indirect contact. This is a bit of a weird one. It's for specific situations where you're exhibiting your book under glass and you're not sure about the degree of air circulation under that glass. It's likely to be limited anyway. Often it's non-existent air circulation. So whatever air gets trapped in that under that glass is the air that's going to stay there for the duration of your display. I'm showing you here a boiled egg because that emits sulfur gas. And the interesting thing about this indirect contact risk is that it's invisible, and yet it can be quite damaging. So you put an egg under glass with a silver spoon, and about 24 hours later, you're getting tarnishing on your spoon. You don't see a thing. You'd probably smell something if you opened it up. But that's how damaging some of these chemical reactions, these invisible chemical reactions can be when they are when they're in their volatile state and when they're trapped, right? When they can't get out because there's no air circulation. Yet this is also something that you can mitigate against, and it's also a limited worry if you understand what it is you're worrying about. So first of all, in pop-up and open air situations, this is a non-problem, or it's as much of a problem as you being in the environment, because we're all exposed to volatile organic compounds, some of which are poisonous to humans, some of which aren't so great for books. But generally speaking, if there's air circulation, then it's as good as you're going to get. So it's really only under glass that you're worried. If it's under glass for a shorter period of time, that's less of a problem because there's less chance for the compounds to be building up and having reactions against the other materials. But for permanent display, it becomes a really big problem. Once you put glass down in a cabinet, it's unlikely that anybody's going to be lifting it up anytime soon. It's heavy, it's awkward. So that's when you could have building up of things as a special interest. You might think that everything under your glass is safe and good to go. You've got you've chosen the right materials to support your books. It's an acid-free buffered board, or it's a powder coated metal, or it's Perspex, some really inert material that you know is okay. But you're exhibiting your book next to some other historical object that, who knows, all objects emit VOCs. And so the more you put complex material objects under glass with their supporting materials, the more you're creating a soup of chemical complexity in there. And at that point, I think you really want to consult with a conservator, somebody who really understands the chemistry behind here that can make informed decisions about how you want to proceed. Again, rule of thumb, if it's a shorter exhibition, you're going to be able to get away with a lot more than if you're thinking about something more permanent. Okay, so that was indirect contact, that sort of invisible gas thing. Now we've got the direct contact. We all know this. I'm sure we've all seen it right in the back of a frame when you open up your artwork and realize that somebody had put the passe-partout without it wasn't acid free. So you get this acid discoloration, or somebody was using tape and the glue from the tape has created an acid bleed. This is direct contact damage, and it can be quite debilitating on paper objects. Um, but again, with this type of risk, it's important to think about what is it we're worrying about and why, and what is the context. So looking again at the context, is this a pop-up display? If something's sitting on a support for 2 hours or 3 days and there's a lot of air circulation, it's unlikely that you're going to get major damage. This is the type of damage that tends to produce over time. If something's under glass, again, you're less likely to be able to access it, so you might want to think a little bit more carefully about materials that you're using. I think the take-home message here is when you're getting into these complex conservation questions, think about what your context is. And I always say, if your context, given that we want to take the books out and we want to be able to interact with them, if that's key, which we've already established to a certain extent, it is if we can be safe about it, then we have to think about, are we worrying about chemical risks here? Or are we worrying about physical risks? And in pop-up situations where we're interacting with the objects, physical risks are real. Dropping a book can create more damage to that book than it sitting on an acidic surface for 2 days when there's lots of air circulation. So figuring out, like, what is the complex risk situation in here and what is more important to mitigate against, such that we can still have the effect of being able to interact with our books, then that's a valid decision to make. If something's under glass and people are not interacting with it, then you're less likely to have it fall off. So then you may want to look at other risk factors. Okay, so then we have direct contact that's due to strapping. So we all know that when we try to exhibit a book open, some of those books are happy to stay open, the other ones pop shut. Often it depends on where in the book you're trying to keep the book open. So more often than not, you do need to be able to weigh the page down in some way or another. Mylar tapes is the go-to under glass or for temporary exhibits. It's a very safe inert material, great for this sort of purpose. Two problems, and this is again that chemical versus physical risk thing that we're looking at. The problem with Mylar is the reason it's inert is because it has no plasticizers. It's a really, really uh, pure material. And because it has no plasticizers, it's quite stiff and it has really sharp edges. So if you're moving it around a lot, so for pop-up exhibitions or where you want to take it off to show a client the next page, you're running the risk that maybe something just gets torn or stuck and you end up tearing a page, which is the opposite of what you're trying to do when you're caring for it. And the other issue with the mylar tapes is they need to be attached with tape. Sometimes that tape can stick to the page and then you end up tearing the page because of the tape. An alternative is bondage tape, which is highly plasticized, not great for long-term use, not great under glass, but quite good when it comes to not getting tangled in the page, and also because it's self-sticky, it will never stick to the book. So that's a valid option in certain contexts. Knowing your context is key. When you're physically interacting with the book, so for instance, for those sit down sort of show and tell or pop up, or even at book fairs where you're pulling the book in and out, having snakes or weights that are really easily removable so that you can turn the pages is a really safe approach. Okay, now we've got shear stress. This is another one of those ones that you didn't know you needed to worry about, and now I'm going to tell you you need to worry about it only in certain instances. Um, when you have a friable book binding or a book binding that has loose parts, often silk bindings where the silk is not attached to the board underneath, flaky leather, flaky paper, boards that are a little bit loose, you don't want to have that being exhibited on any sort of anti-slip material. Anti-slip material as an exhibition surface can be really useful when there's high traffic because your book isn't going to slip off. But the moment you have a friable binding, then what happens is you've got this shear stress. You've got like the friction holding up the book. The shear stress is the force that wants to pull it downward but can't, and then you end up getting this friable material caught on that the anti-slip surface, and you end up losing materials because of it, or even tearing. Anti-slip, it's basically it's a friction coefficient. Some materials have a high friction coefficient and others have a really low. So low friction coefficient is very slippery. The other stuff is really quite sticky. Velour can have quite a high friction coefficient. It tends to stick to itself. So be careful when you're using velour cushions against this type of material. You can have the friable pieces fall off on the velour. So just pay a little bit of attention to how loose the binding pieces are, and then think about, do you want a smoother surface or do you want a stickier surface? And here's an example of how powerful this force can actually be. This is a 50-degree angle, and this is a high friction coefficient material. And you can see that this book is not sliding off a 50-degree incline, but put it on a smooth, this has like virtually no, well, there is no virtually no, but this very, very slippery surface, the book just immediately slides down. So there can be a really big difference there. And you can sort of imagine how this force, right? This force that's counteracting the force of gravity at a 50-degree angle can also be pulling away at your silk. Okay, so now we have the real problem of dealing with flat documents, loose documents, fold-out maps, and plates. I'm not going to lie, this tends to be a real bespoke problem because every fold-out map is a different size and folds out in a different way and has its different problems. Sizing can be an issue. So I think the rule of thumb that I can give you here is to think about flow. Paper is born out of a flowing movement, right? If you see this Japanese paper maker, bottom left, there's a dance, there's a flow of movement, and that actually creates a grain in the paper, a particular direction in the paper, just by virtue of the movement of the body when it makes the paper dries, and you can see it continues to have this beautiful flow like a wave. So work with it rather than against it. Work with the flow of the map as it comes out of the book and see if you can somehow lightly support it. It's a little bit like you're surfing with a wave rather than fighting against the wave. And in that way, create some sort of support to just very, very lightly hold the fold out maps as they kind of cascade downwards. Um, Other things you can do, especially in the pop-up type situation where people may want to be looking or accessing the item. Maybe it's like a a 4-page pamphlet, or just a 2-page letter or something where you actually want to be able to flip back and forth. Think about ways where you're not creating permanent framing solutions, but rather situations where you can easily pull the glass off, or an L-shaped mylar sleeve is really useful because it's very easy to pull the document in and out, and yet once it's in there with a cardboard backing, it's protected against splashing, against bending, and looks relatively nice. You can even, because it's got a rigid back, you can put it up on a stand and you can present it that way. All different ways of being able to relatively safely display these really fragile items. Okay, now here's another problem which you didn't know you had until I'm going to tell you now that you have it, or you might have it, and it's a really annoying problem, but it's also solvable. Fitting books on angles under glass. Uh, the first thing to think about is when you put something under glass, you have to think about the inside dimension of the glass, and you have to think about when you push something, when you open a book up and when you push it forward, the top edges of that book may have a completely different dimension than what you were expecting, and you don't want to have those. Well, you want to be able to put the glass down without it hitting the book, but also it's really nice to have a sort of a margin, a little bit of space for that book to breathe. The good news is that you can solve that problem in advance by understanding a little bit about geometry and thinking about this idea of margin and breathing. It's all calculatable. They're just angles. It's high school math, and with a little bit of thought, you can make sure that before you're about ready, poised to bring the glass down and realize that it's not going to fit around your exhibition, that you can actually make those calculations. Okay, that was all of the worry part. Now we're going to get to the fun part. Um, how do you bring the crowds in? How do you make a book display that really is exciting? When I make these displays, I realize that I'm working a display a little bit like somebody might work a painting. There's this sort of almost like kind of sculpting a book display out of nothing, and with just a few tools. So I'm going to try to give you some of the tools that I use, like the kind of thinking tools that I use to create a book display that is actually exciting. Um, so the keys here are attention, grabbing someone's attention, creating a sense of excitement, and then drawing them in to give them that experience of intimacy. And first, I call this the serenity pair because there's just bits about putting a book exhibition together where you just have no control over, especially in pop-up situations, things you can't control. And if you can't control it, don't fight it, work with it, and figure out what it is that you can control. Things you can't control, book sizes, they are what they are. If you've got a large folio and it needs to go front and center, well, there you have it. You're going to have to work with it. Humans are a certain size. We can only reach this high and look down that low, and you got to work with it. You got to understand that it's human beings who are going to be looking at your exhibition. Furniture, often you're working with what you get. Room lighting is really important, and often we have zero control over it. The things that you can control, though, are angles of display. So if you can't change the lighting in the room, you can move the book around and catch the light in a different way. Direction of approach, you may not have been able to choose which booth or which furniture you have, but you can certainly manipulate or get people drawn into your booth just by understanding how they might approach it and trying to position books in such a way that it catches their attention. Spotlighting, if you have it, run towards it and make sure it's LED. And what you can do is expand and contract the shelf levels. So that's useful because often in cases, we have this glass case thing that I was just telling you about earlier. But often in pop-up exhibitions and book fairs, you have a problem with case depth. They can be quite shallow, but you can work with the height. So sometimes you can win a little bit in that arena. Okay, so that bit about drawing in the crowds, gathering people's attention, you're thinking about you have to remember that this book is this intimate thing where we're used to working with it really close up, and yet we need to grab people's attention from afar. So being able to understand how people approach your booth and making sure that there are angles of opening that invite them in and that people feel as though they could come in and have that intimate experience. If you can plan it that way, use it to your advantage. So here we've got that wide angle view. How are we going to grab their attention, even though we can't actually read what's on the page yet? What you're doing is you're working with shapes and light and trying to create a sort of a dynamic display so that people are like, "Oh, what's that thing? Let me go in for a closer look." You're creating a sort of a sense of excitement. What's happening is the brain is going like, "Oh, what is that?" Like I don't really understand it, but I want to understand it. And then you've got their attention, right? Okay, so then how do you've got their attention. Now they're coming in for a closer look. Now you have this chance to give them a feeling of intimacy. Now you have to pay a little bit more attention to, so from afar, it doesn't really, it matters much less what angle you're showing your book at, but the moment you approach it, this is when our view towards the book is highly dependent on where the book is compared to the human being. So if it's chest, if it's eye level, or if it's belly level, and that's when a forward tilting angle can be really useful to make the person not have to strain to see the thing, and that allows them to have a comfortable intimacy and allows you to maximize your shelf levels. Okay. Interestingly here, that just to kind of illustrate that point, if you can see here on the picture on the left, in the corner, you have this book with a horse. It looks as though it's on a very shallow angle, but when you approach it, so this is me taking the picture in both instances from the same level. When you approach it, suddenly it looks like that book is popping up. It's the same angle, it's the same book and the same person, but you can see the difference in an intimate contact where where the 35-degree angle is useful. So playing with these angles can be very, very helpful in drawing the people in. Okay, then again, that story, you can't control the lighting, but you could absolutely work with the book. You can move the book around. Books have two beautiful shapes. One is that curve, right? And then you can grab the light and have the light sort of roll around the curve in a exciting and beautiful way. Work with it, move the book around until you catch that light. The same with angles. If you can catch the book or catch the light at different angles, a book is an angular thing, and then you've got your play of shadow and light, and that can be very, very exciting. So work with those two. That's what you got. So work with them. And then finally, what do the results look like? If you've got all of these tools to work with, what can you actually get out of putting a little bit more effort into book display? On the left, you've got a sort of a standard. This is how we're used to normally looking at books. We're used to seeing books as objects for contemplation and not necessarily objects of beauty, but throw a little bit of light at it, throw some angles at it, turn things around in different ways, and then suddenly you've got a really dynamic display that draws you in, and you can still have that intimate connection with the book. Okay, so finally, I'm going to end with this idea of finding a balance. On the one hand, we're bringing the book out. It's a little bit like showing them the Night Watch or like the crown jewels. And yet the book still really is an intimate. We have to understand what it is we're showing. We're not showing the crown jewels. We're showing these sort of more intimate, contemplative objects, and our audience are those types of people too. So overdoing it can be just as bad as underdoing it. So finding a sort of a golden mean between sort of like over glorification and humility, and working with that, I think really gives to me what I think is a perfect book display. And then also finding that balance between preserving and caring for the book, but not to the point of not being able to do something really fun and exciting with the book, engaging the public, engaging the younger public who is so excited to see books, is not familiar with being able to see them, get so excited when they get to actually touch something, to promote that possibility and do it in a way that you can mitigate against risk, I think also creates, to me, a really successful book exhibition. And that's it.
That is fantastic, Natasha. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I'm going to start off. We have some questions, but I'm going to start off because I'm thinking about the New York Book Fair coming up, and you start out with your booth, and they give you some Windex products. And the minute you said something about chemicals, and I thought, here we are, we're starting our book fair, and we're spraying everything with this Windex. Is there any downside to that?
That's a good question. Well, again, air circulation, as long as you have a lot of air circulation, so on the outside, it's as much of a problem to your books while they're outside of the case as the books. It is the same problem that we are all having. We're breathing in that stuff too. Windex also evaporates quickly, so that's less
Okay.
of a problem. And when it evaporates, again, air circulation. So you might be cleaning the inside of the window, keep the doors open. If you keep both doors open within a certain amount of time, the air will circulate and it will come back to neutral. So that's that thing about air
Right.
circulation is your friend, and it's of course at the expense of security. But
But
to
yeah,
the
I guess when we were setting up, and that's really helpful because all of a sudden I just had that moment of going, oh my God, we've been doing this for years. So I'm going to start off with Dawn. What are the risks of exhibiting under glass ceiling?
Under a glass ceiling. Ooh, that's a good one. So much of this depends on how much thought and expense did they go did they put into building the building? So there might be a glass ceiling, but it's really modern and they've thought about UV and they've thought about environmental issues and they've thought about sealants and all sorts of, I mean, glass has leaps and bounds in the last few years. So I think you shouldn't be worried about glass ceiling. You should be worried about what you're worrying about and checking to see if that's a worry. So, are there UV protection? And if there aren't, then there are other ways that you can mitigate, that you can keep your book safe, even if you do have a glass ceiling, i.e., put a ceiling on your cabinet somehow, or have curtains, or yeah, and ask questions about that. Yeah.
David Solo is asking, I was wondering if Natasha could comment on display practices to enhance the ability to read text in displayed books, especially for image text work in exhibitions versus booth settings.
Ooh, okay. Can you repeat the question? I'm going to make sure I
Sure. So
get it.
he's asking to comment on display practices to
Mhm.
like enhance the ability to read the text. I guess maybe the the best angle maybe that you found that helps people being able to read the text. And is there a is there a high spot in terms of angle?
Okay, so there's angle. Actually, my mind went to, are we thinking about magnification or even enhancing by using a screen next to it and being able to blow up things? That's also a
Oh, that's
cool way of
interesting.
interacting. So it
Maybe
could be.
David can go in again. Somebody asked where you source your book cradles, and Reed Beyer gave the Stilt book cradles website, which is what you have designed. So I have one of those.
Oh, so sourcing book cradles. There are some incredible pillows, and I actually just bought some from Gabby Kleindorfer in Germany, which were the first pillows I've seen that actually hold an angle. They're also velour, which has the positive of being anti-slip, but also the negative of being anti-slip. I think in the States you have various, so for perspex supports, I think that I can't speak to the States, but most preservation places will have some sort of supports in perspex, which is great for long-term under glass. Powder coated metal is a good one for if you can throw some money at it and if it's a long-term solution, then any metal worker will be able to solve your problem in a bespoke sort of a way.
Okay, I have Jackie Becky from she says I work at a small liberal arts college and I'm hoping to pop up outside of our reading room on campus. Any recommendations for portable vitrines? Would love to share these ideas with my students, workers. Any recommendations for entry-level reading tutorials to share with students?
Intro level. Okay, let's start with the pop-up vitrine, which I think is a
Okay.
great idea.
Mhm.
And I don't necessarily have any solutions. However, I have been using it. It depends on budget, but I have been using a local perspex maker who is able to make different shapes for me. And if you can think creatively in that pop-up setting, then think about you don't necessarily need that big cap of glass over your thing, over your book, especially if you want to interact with it. But maybe what you want to do is create a buffer zone. And you can do that quite simply by, it's almost like human psychology. If you put something in front of somebody, between somebody and the book, they're less likely to go for the book. Even just putting those weights or those snakes on a book, it makes it less likely that somebody's going to grab. Having an extra person, keeping an eye, keeping the numbers down. These are all really easy ways to make sure your books are safe in a pop-up situation without having to put a glass wall around people. But if you do want to create some physical barrier, then think about your local perspex maker, and you could maybe come up with some simple, relatively cheap um, temporary solutions that are even movable. That's where
Right.
my mind went there. Yeah. And that
I
second
generally
piece,
like, yeah, I walk through, like sometimes I walk through Home Depot. I walk through like places and try to think of different ways you could use things that you they're not necessarily for their use. Because I just look at I can say, what could I use this for? Um, Somebody's asking, could you speak more about Zoe Langer's asking about mitigating against vellum damage due to fluctuating temperatures and humidity. Is there anything else you can suggest?
yeah. So the real irreversible problem with vellum is when you get heat and humidity, like high humidity, i.e. water, combine in the same place, then you turn vellum into like a toothy nothing. It really is irreversible and kind of the end. Anything that else that happens with vellum can be reversible because vellum is really ply. It's highly it's hydrophilic. It just sucks the water out of the air, but that also means it gives the water back to the air when the air gets drier. So you can remold the shape of the book by very slowly bringing it back to the shape that it was in initially, slowly by slowly changing the relative humidity out of the air. That's something that maybe your conservator wants to do, but it's very doable without causing undue damage. Other than that, it really depends on what this like the moment you get a crack in the vellum, yeah, then all bets are off. And then you've got to work with that. So we'd have to talk about specific damages. I think the point there is limit those two things. Limit the fast fluctuation in those two things, and you've won an awful lot. And then otherwise, don't worry so much. Don't try to get it back into its shape really quickly. Let it slowly reacclimatize. The idea is to slow that curve down because it happened too quickly. So when you want to bring it back to shape, slow the curve down, and you can often get it back.
Jesse Gordon is asking, do you have guidelines for the following? If you are showing a book in a museum exhibition and you want it to be on view for a few months, would you recommend turning the page part way through? How often would you be turning the page?
Okay, that's a really difficult one because I can come up with recommendations, or your local conservator or in-house conservator can come up with specific recommendations depending on the book. Again, if it's just printed paid paper, that's the printing ink, that's very different than if it's hand applied colors. But it will also very heavily depend on who you have on the ground to lift that big heavy thing of glass off to switch a page every day. And the truth of the matter is, you start to run, it's a risk analysis problem where the risk of every day for 3 months removing a really heavy thing of glass by two guys who come in at like 3 a.m. to do it, the risk that something could happen in that time may outweigh the risk of under low light, lights turned off when people aren't in the room, leaving the page at the same page because it's just printed ink. You're really weighing risks. I mean, unless you're talking about you actually want to turn the page so that the viewer can see a different page the next day, that's a whole other story. In which case, yes, do it if you can, because that's cool.
And Noah Peterson is asking, will the slideshow be available?
Oh, will it, Elizabeth?
I mean, it will definitely be obviously on the YouTube the ABAA YouTube channel. We'll
Ah,
be putting this
okay.
talk up in a couple of days.
So
But
then you can see it
I
there. Yeah.
guess that's a different question. And Emma Nelson is asking, I work in a rare book library with very limited funding, so we're quite restricted in terms of book supports, besides cushions for our readers. What would you suggest for exhibiting books temporary under glass that would enable us to support the books as they need while allowing flexibility in terms of angles of display? So I guess, you know,
Mm.
um, limited funding is the
Yeah, yeah, limited funding. So if you can get hold of acid-free cardboard and a box knife and a ruler, you can do an and if you like geometry in high school, you can do an awful lot with just folding cardboard. And in fact, when I did research for STILT, I went to a lot of different museums all across Europe to sort of see what do they do when they're stuck exhibiting a book, because every museum everywhere has this problem once in their lives. And it was really interesting to see how creative the people in the exhibitions department were trying to create a kind of an ad hoc a book display for their one-off book that they have to stick in an under glass every 10 years. So if they can do it, you can do it. Geometry, acid-free buffered cardstock, and a box cutter will get you far on a really limited budget, I think.
Wow, that is actually a great idea. I didn't really think about that. One more question, Scott Gibbons, transporting books. Would you put them in plastic bags or would that trap humidity and potentially cause damage? This is a great question.
Mhm. I never pack things in plastic, although I do use bubble wrap in the end just before it goes through the box. So this is how I think about I'm not actually sure what best practice would say, and I will go and research this. But how I do it is I always wrap in multiple layers of paper because I like the idea that that humidity, because there's going to be a humidity differential and the thing needs to breathe. Paper is great, right? Because it's hydrophilic and it will suck it out and it will bring it in. It kind of it's like an insulating kind of buffer. But I am in the end worried about water. Like I'm imagining that this parcel is going to sit on a sidewalk and it's going to start to rain before somebody thinks to bring it in. Like you sort of imagine all of the possible worst case scenarios. So I end up then wrapping once I've packed all of my books in this papery buffer, and I wrap the whole thing in bubble wrap because that's going to be my plastic foil against moisture from the outside, and it's also buffering against any bumping. That's how I do it, but I'd be really curious to hear how other people.
I have seen people use adult diapers.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah, and they last a very long time. So everybody's has their little trick on that. Well, thank you so much, Natasha. Really appreciate it. It's been really, especially the book fair season is opening up, and I know everybody gets a little anxious, nervous right before. So hopefully this has helped people, and really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me.
And thanks for everybody for coming. And if anybody has any suggestions for other brown bag lunch, please get in touch with the headquarters of ABAA. Thanks, and we're getting tons of thank yous here. So, and again, remember it'll be on our ABAA YouTube channel. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.